Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today I'm bringing you 13 viral news stories from the 1920s and 1930s. If you're ready to hear about some freak accidents of vintage times, keep watching. In the early days of Time magazine, they ran a weekly column called Miscellany, which compiled offbeat and sometimes downright baffling news blurbs from all over the world. These are a few of the more macabre items to be found in that column. The first one was printed on May 25, 1925, and reads, "In London, one Professor Thomas Waddington encountered a snail crawling along a railroad track, crawled after the small creature to observe its habits, was overtaken after a brief study by a London train. Both snail and professor were killed." If that wording was hard to follow, a London professor was crawling along a train track, apparently hyperfixated on observing the habits of a snail, when a train came along and killed them both. I also found a very short article from the Madeira Tribune, printed 10 days earlier, that pretty much says the same thing. The only additional information they gave was that the professor was a member of the Kettering Naturalist Society, and they left out the information that the snail also perished. Now, at first I was thinking it's a little dismissive of the professor to mention the snail's death as if it's on par with that of the poor guy who was stalking it. But then I had to admit that if they hadn't commented on the fate of the snail, the question would have been nagging at me for days. So good reporting there, I guess. This next one was also printed on May 25, 1925, and reads, "In Coney Island, New York, one hairy man," seriously? "went for a ride on a giant coaster. On the rear seat sat a male and female lovingly. Curious about their activities, man drew a mirror from his pocket, stood up in his seat, tottered, fell under the rear wheels, was ground to death." This one's worded less confusingly, but in case it was unclear, a couple were making out in the rear seat of an amusement park ride when this creeper decided to stand up and pull out a mirror to get a better look at them. He might as well have just turned around and looked at that point. He ended up losing his footing and falling under the rear wheels of the ride, where he was killed. I'm wondering if the ride they're talking about was actually the Giant Racer, which was one of the main roller coasters at Coney Island from 1911 until 1926, when it was torn down to make room for the Cyclone, which is actually still in use today. However, I couldn't find any record of Hairy Man's death, or a death that fits this description on any of the rides. I'm actually really interested in Coney Island history, so this one was fun to research. Every time I look at something about Coney Island, I end up going down a rabbit hole and don't come out for hours. This next one actually doesn't involve a death, just a bit of maiming. Oddly, it was also originally printed on May 25, 1925. It reads, "In Winsted, Connecticut, famed as a home of strange events, one Charles Alling beheld a large crane caught by the foot in a wire fence, went to save the pitiable fowl. The crane drove its beak into Alling's left eye, permanently blinded him." I think this was pretty self-explanatory. I couldn't find any more information on this situation, but I can certainly see how it could happen. And now I'm dying to know more about the famed strange events that Winsted, Connecticut is reportedly home to. The next one was printed on December 10, 1928, and reads, "In the U.S., there are many thousands of fantastic gourmets who put cream on their bananas, who butter their celery, who eat apples with salt. One of the last, Kenneth M. Hall of Austin, Texas, an undergraduate of Texas University, last week accidentally sprinkled not salt, but poisonous crystals on his apple, ate it, died." Who keeps poisonous crystals with their salt? And who actually salts their apples? If you do, let me know in the comments. Of course, this led me back to the Google, and it turns out that adding a pinch of salt to fruit is actually said to amplify the fruit's natural flavor. So I shall be trying that in the near future. I too can gourmet. On December 29, 1929, Time shared this one that reads, "In Dubuque, Iowa, one Joseph Bourne protested to a policeman that he had not been speeding according to his speedometer, was ordered to test it by driving in front of the officer, did so, ran down and killed Mrs. Minnie Egg." I honestly don't even know what to say about this. The February 3, 1930 edition included the following: In Mount Morris, New York, a joker put a tack on the chair of Angelina Saranet, who sat on the tack, squeaked, contracted blood poisoning, died. This was a really common prank back in the day. Not at all funny, but really common. Some unoriginal imbeciles are probably still pulling it today. Of course, I got overly curious and tried to find out if anyone else had actually died as a result of this particular practical joke. The answer is no, not that I could find. The next one, from June 9th, 1930, reads, in Griffin, Georgia, Mrs. Kite Gaston swallowed her false teeth when choir singing, died of strangulation. Once again, I've Googled this so you don't have to. Apparently, it's not uncommon to partially swallow and choke on dentures, the things many people use to chew their food, which is also a consistent choking hazard. That's just friggin' great. I admit I'm a little touchy because I nearly choked to death a couple months ago, have serious difficulty swallowing in general, and will most likely need dentures eventually. One more thing that'll probably try to kill me. I think it's best to move on now, so, on November 3rd, 1930, Time printed a blurb that read, in Manhattan, Mrs. May Byrne, 42, died of blood poisoning contracted after an accident. The accident? While both slapped her finger straight into her husband's mouth, he bit it. What the frig? Since this is the second one that mentions blood poisoning as a cause of death, let's take a look at what that actually is. Blood poisoning is what we also know as sepsis or septicemia, which is a life-threatening complication of an infection. Sepsis occurs when chemicals released in the bloodstream to fight an infection trigger inflammation throughout the body. This can cause a cascade of changes that damage multiple organ systems, leading them to fail, sometimes even resulting in death. Symptoms include fever, difficulty breathing, low blood pressure, fast heart rate, and mental confusion. This is why we don't bite people, and should be incredibly thankful for antibiotics, which were first prescribed in the late 1930s. This is a really sad entry from December 1st, 1930. It reads, in Augsburg, Germany, Annie Rossmeyer, 16, and Fanny Schlegel, 18, were placing flowers on the grave of Annie's mother. The 300-pound monument fell, killed Annie, wounded Fanny. I couldn't find any additional information on this story, but for context, this is a 300-pound headstone that collapsed and killed a 5-year-old girl just last year. I have to admit I never really thought about this before, but this story made me curious about how often people are actually injured by unsafe headstones. I was shocked by how many stories came up immediately of children and adults being killed by toppling cemetery memorials in just recent years. Due to these instances, many local authorities in the UK will carry out regular inspections of cemeteries, sometimes seeing fit to lay a headstone down to prevent it from toppling over and potentially injuring someone. It's usually the responsibility of the living relatives of the deceased to repair or replace unsafe grave markers. I couldn't find as much information about cemetery safety measures in the US, but I'm not so sure we really believe in common sense death or injury prevention here, in general. This next story is truly heartbreaking and mind-boggling. It was printed on August 10, 1931, and reads, near Dozier, Alabama, lived a family of 3, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Mitchell and their son, Love. In one day, the father died of a paralytic stroke, the son was struck by lightning and killed. The mother, shocked by the double tragedy, collapsed and died. This brings up the topic of whether or not it's actually possible to die from a broken heart. The answer is yes. Called broken heart syndrome, this condition is brought on by stressful circumstances, often the death of a loved one. But it's also been known to happen due to other factors, such as bankruptcy, losing a job, divorce, a terminal medical diagnosis, or even the stress of public speaking. According to the American Heart Association, broken heart syndrome, or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, is a reaction your heart has to a surge of stress hormones caused by an emotionally stressful event. Broken heart syndrome causes the heart to stop operating normally, resulting in heart failure. During these situations, the body releases an increase in hormones, which temporarily paralyzes your heart and limits its standard functionality. This condition can develop in anyone, even somebody who's healthy by all other standards. Thankfully, it isn't always deadly. In fact, it's almost always treatable with medical intervention. As for the death of the sun, according to the CDC, lightning is one of the leading causes of weather-related fatalities. However, the odds of being struck by lightning in a given year are only 1 in 500,000. The odds of being struck by lightning on the same day that a family member suffers a devastating stroke are probably a lot less. An article from August 10, 1931 reads, "In Denver, Mr. and Mrs. Warren E. McLean lay on their folding bed listening to a radio program. The bed snapped shut, killed Warren E. McLean." I thought this was something that just happened in old movies and TV shows, but it turns out these early Murphy beds have actually been moderately deadly. I guess I've always assumed that the body weight of a human on top of them would hold them down. Our next to last story was printed on December 7, 1931, and reads, "In Chicago, Roy McGiven fell on the street and hurt himself. Recovering, he was hit by an automobile, injured again. On his feet once more, Roy McGiven slipped beneath the wheels of a train, was killed." All I can think of are the Final Destination movies, where death will just keep relentlessly trying to get you when it's your turn. Our final story was printed by Time magazine on November 5, 1934. It reads, "In Morris, Illinois, John Prombo saw a cow chewing her cud in the path of a speeding train. Racing down the railroad tracks, he coaxed, tugged, pushed, could not budge the placid animal. In the instant before the train was upon them, the cow loped safely off the tracks. The engine killed John Prombo." I think what we've learned here today is that clearly trying to assist unfamiliar animals never did anybody any favors in the 1920s and 30s, and life-threatening dangers lurking around every corner. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed these stories and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVIDpod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have a crazy story to share, I'd love to hear all about it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.